It's time to get wired in. Let's talk about software development. So today, I want to talk about progressive web apps. Progressive web apps are basically apps that are run through a browser that have native capabilities. That's what a progressive web app is in a nutshell. And back in 2015, I believe, Google made the announcement they're going to support progressive web apps. Then Microsoft, years later, actually this year, I think maybe last year, they mentioned it as well. I think this year they mentioned supporting progressive web apps through the Microsoft Store. So anytime we hear about a new technology or a new trend as developers, we're thinking, I got to learn this. This is where everything is going. And I do think progressive web apps are cool. And I've read a lot of articles where they're saying this is the end of native apps and, progressive web apps are the future, which I think progressive web apps are the future, but I still think there is a place for native apps. And I think progressive web apps are good for businesses who are building internal applications. I think if you're going to build a progressive web app as an indie dev, one of the issues you might have is coming up with a monetization strategy. I believe you can place ads in progressive web apps. I know I was reading a forum post where I think AdSense, there were issues placing ads or banner ads. I don't know if that's fixed now. In-app purchases, you can go through different payment options such as PayPal, getting people to subscribe via PayPal. But one of the benefits of native apps is that you don't have to worry about asking people for their credit card information, for an in-app purchase or for a subscription or just to pay for the app up front. That was handled within the App Store or the Play Store. So with progressive web apps, I think it's a little more challenging to monetize these apps. Now, unless in the future we'll see the App Store, and I think already in the Play Store and the Microsoft Store, you can download progressive web apps. Maybe they figure out a way that you can use in-app purchases and or just to pay for the app up front. I think that's how you can monetize the progressive web app. But then people are like, well, you might as well build a native app, which is true essentially. But I think progressive web apps are good if you don't want to go through the stores. I think a lot of businesses are moving towards progressive web apps because, for one, you only need one code base. You don't have to worry about building two different code bases to publish an app in the App Store or the Play Store. Now, you can use cross-platform tools such as Xamarin or Ionic, and it will compile the code into native code. And you can share about 90% of the logic in Xamarin. I can't really speak for Ionic, never used it. But you still have to distribute the app in two separate stores, and you have to create two separate accounts. And one of the issues with native apps for businesses is the process of getting the app approved. I know Apple, you have to go through, I think, a 2-week process, sometimes 4 weeks, it depends. But I've heard they've gotten a lot better with approving apps in the store. Google Play usually doesn't take that long. It depends on the app, I believe. I think now they've become a little bit more strict on just letting any app in the store. I released an app a couple weeks ago, and normally when I submit an app in the Play Store, within about 2 hours it's live, but I noticed it took about 8 hours. So I think they're really starting to crack down on these malware apps by testing new apps that are being distributed in the store. So, which I think is smart. But I do think developers should learn progressive web apps, because progressive web apps also allow certain native capabilities. And so does web apps, because progressive web app is basically is being used through a browser. So browsers have come a long way. Like you can get push notifications. I believe you can access the camera. I mean, you can access the camera even with web apps. And the major difference between a progressive web app and a standard mobile website is progressive web apps are a lot faster, because it allows you to work. It allows for the app to work offline as well. Whereas with a mobile website, you have to be connected through a network, through the internet, and depending on your speed, it might not be a good connection, which can cause performance issues, which can frustrate the user. Now, I know developers are like, well, I think I'm going to build progressive web apps, but I believe before you build a mobile app or any kind of application, you have to look at the use case scenario. So I'm going to give you scenarios on when to build each. So if you want to build a native app, if you want to access that platform's particular operating system, such as Bluetooth, you really want to access the hardware for that particular device. So I think a native app is the way to go. If you don't have a problem, distributing your app through the stores, going through the process, I think that's fine. But I believe a progressive web app, you should use it as an indie dev if you have a client. So let's say you have a client that has a restaurant, and let's say you meet with a client, they tell you, well, we want to be able to have an app that users can place an order, they can pick it up, they can be notified. Back in the day, you would create a native app to handle all these things, because push notifications, access to your contacts, maps. I don't know how the support of maps in progressive web apps. Like, I haven't developed any progressive web apps as of yet, but I know you can get access to location. So you would have to say, I think the progressive web app is a better option, because you only need basic functionality. You want users to place an order, push notifications, access the location. You really don't need to go through the hassle of distributing the apps to the native stores. With the progressive web app, you can host that on a server, and anytime you need to make a change to the app, it's instant, it's live. If you need to make a change to a native app, you would have to recompile the app and distribute it through the app stores and go through the review process again. So I think progressive web apps are good if you're building an application for a business and they want to reach more users, and they don't have to worry about paying for app store fees. Well, with Google, I believe it's still only $25 one-time fee, but with Apple, it's $100 a year, and I believe it's $200 a year for enterprise. So it's a little expensive on the Apple side of things. And if you're building for iOS, you have to have a Mac, you have to have an iPhone, iPad to test these applications. So the cost of barrier is a little high for developing for iOS or for developing in the Apple ecosystem. Now, a lot of developers don't really bother developing for Apple because of, it's a little too expensive. Some developers can't afford a Mac, so they just develop for Android because you can just buy a Windows PC. You can develop for Windows and Google. It's much easier. Now, don't get me wrong, I do believe as a developer you should target all platforms, and progressive web apps makes it a lot easier for you to do so. But if you're building consumer apps, in my opinion, I think the native or hybrid approach is better than the progressive web app approach at the moment. Now, I think over time, progressive web apps will evolve and potentially replace native apps in the future. But right now, I still think native apps are here to stay. The app development has matured a lot within the last 10 years. Because in the early days, you had to have two separate code bases to develop an app for iPhone, Android, and even Windows Phone at the time. So it cost organizations more money. With a progressive web app, you just know HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You can build a progressive web app, and you can use some of the popular JavaScript frameworks such as Angular or React. I'm going to experiment using. I'm going to use Angular. I was going to use React, but I think I'm going to start off using Angular, and then I'm going to build a progressive web app using React. Because I just do believe as a developer, you should experiment and learn new technologies. It keeps things interesting. Using the same technologies every single day can get kind of repetitive, and it can get boring, and you can lose the love for something. It's like working a day job. You're doing the same thing over and over. Even if you're a software developer, using the same technologies every single day. But when you learn something new, it's good for your brain. You're learning, and you explore other possibilities to solve a problem. So I do believe developers should take a look at progressive web apps, but I don't believe you should just fully commit to only developing progressive web apps. I believe progressive web apps are best suited at the moment for businesses. It's easy to just get up and running, and you can use any device because it's through the browser. You can use an iPhone, an iPad, Android phone, or even your desktop. So it's consistent. It's not a mobile website, because if you're building a mobile website, it's going to look different when it's on a desktop. Most websites, well, they're responsive websites, but not all sites are mobile first. Progressive web apps are mobile first. It has a mobile first approach. So that's really my take on progressive web apps. I've done a lot of reading about it, and for me, I want to start really focusing more on building applications for different businesses. But I have a Mac, and I was going to do some iOS development. I was going to publish some apps through the App Store, but my Mac is so outdated that I have to buy a new Mac, which I really can't afford right now. My goal is, once I start really making more revenue for my company, I can purchase a Mac for the company and I can publish native iOS apps. But I'm exploring other options like renting a Mac in the cloud. And I'm probably going to use Xamarin to build my mobile apps for Android and iOS. But right now, I'm mostly developing Android apps using Java. Not even using Kotlin, but I'm using Java. And I'm also building UWP apps using C#. So native approach for me. But I'm more open to progressive web apps. Here's another interesting point. A lot of developers also want to migrate their apps to progressive web apps, because I think some developers are having issues with getting their apps approved through the App Store. Apple, they're making developers make so many changes, minor changes. You have to resubmit the app, go through it again. I think it's a tedious process to get your app through the App Store. So I think developers are just really tired of it. You're paying $100 a year, but if you're making money in that ecosystem, I still think you should publish apps through the App Store. But if you're starting out, you have to look at the barrier of entry. What's your return on investment paying $100 a year? Now, I've had debates with other developers, and they're like, well, it's only $100. But still, if you're paying $100 a year and you're only making $20 a year off an app because the app stores are very crowded, you have to really spend more money to market your app. So once you develop the app, you have to market it. One thing about progressive web apps, because it's on the web, I think it's a lot easier for people to find your apps through search engine optimization, using keywords. You can provide a link on your website for users to download and install progressive web apps. Now, progressive web apps, they function through a browser, but usually you're prompted to add the progressive web app to the home screen. So essentially it's installing it. Instead of going to actually typing in the domain to access the progressive web app, you can just click the button on your home screen and it's not taking up space. One thing about native apps is it takes up a lot of space. Some apps take up a lot of space, and that it accumulates over time, and users, they're going to remove the app. And I think users are kind of like not really focused on downloading a new app unless they have to. If you look at the top 10, 20 apps in all the app stores, they're mostly dominated by Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, the big companies. So you have to have a really niche app that people will download and keep using, and you have to market it. So there are a lot of great apps in the app stores, but discoverability is a problem. I think it'll be easier with progressive web apps because people can instantly just start using the app. They don't have to worry about being redirected to download the app from the stores. So that's my take on progressive web apps. I think it's really exciting. I like where mobile development is heading. So also I want to mention progressive web apps doesn't really matter to the consumer. And what I mean is it doesn't matter how it's created. Consumers don't care how the application is created, as long as it solves their problem, as long as it functions. So don't worry about, consumers are not worried about if it's progressive or native or hybrid. That's more for the developers and the product owner. That's for them to worry about. So I'm looking to explore developing progressive web apps. I'm going to continue developing native apps. I don't know about hybrid apps. Hybrid apps are basically applications that are wrapped through a web view. But if you're using a web view, I believe you have to use some native functionality. Like I think Apple stopped template apps from being distributed through the App Store, which is 10% of the code is being used and 90% it uses a web view. I think it violates their policy. I don't know how they'll go about with progressive web apps, but I think Apple is working on supporting progressive web apps in the future. And I do think in the future progressive web apps will be the standard because I think people will use more progressive web apps because it's not accumulating a lot of space and it's easier to access. Like I said, the only thing that's my concern as an indie developer is the monetization strategy with progressive web apps. I still think there are little hurdles to make it easier for us to deal with in-app purchases or subscriptions, or for people to just buy the app up front. But I believe with ads, I think it's a lot easier depending with which ad network you use. So that's my take on progressive web apps. What's your take on progressive web apps? Leave a comment below in the App Store if you listen through the App Store. Apple Podcasts. I'm sorry. It's not App Store, Apple Podcast. Or what are your thoughts? Reach out to me on Twitter at Appavelli, Appaveli, at Appavelli. On Instagram, you can follow the Instagram page at Appavelli Podcast. I would like to know what your take is on progressive web apps, or did I leave out any important details? So that's it. So now I'm going to go write some code. Make sure you guys stay productive, and I am out.